Margaret Johnson stepped into the Golden Mile, her heart filled with a mixture of excitement and nostalgia. The restaurant, nestled in the bustling heart of Chicago, had become her sanctuary of sorts over the years, a place that held countless memories of laughter and family gatherings. Today was her 75th birthday, and she expected nothing less than the warmth and celebration she had received here before. As she pushed through the heavy glass doors, the familiar sounds of clinking dishes and muffled conversations wrapped around her like a warm blanket. The aroma of seasoned steak and baked bread wafted through the air, drawing a smile from Margaret as she scanned the busy dining area for a free table. She had called a week in advance to reserve her favorite spot by the window, which offered a panoramic view of the city's twinkling lights. However, as she approached the host station, she was met not with smiles and birthday wishes, but with a cold indifference from a young waiter she hadn't seen before. The waiter, Peter, was busily shuffling papers and seemed annoyed at her interruption. "Good evening, I'm Margaret Johnson. I have a reservation for tonight," she said, her voice steady despite the flicker of disappointment. Peter glanced up, his eyes briefly meeting hers before returning to his notepad. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we are fully booked. There's no reservation under that name," he replied curtly, not bothering to double-check the reservation book. Margaret's brow furrowed in confusion. "That's impossible. I confirmed just yesterday. Could you please check again?" Peter sighed heavily, as if Margaret's request was a great inconvenience to him. "Look, lady, I told you there are no tables available. Maybe you should try somewhere else tonight." Stunned by his dismissive tone, Margaret felt a familiar ache in her chest, a remnant of days long past when she had often been on the receiving end of similar dismissals. However, she wasn't a young activist facing down segregation anymore. She was a respected matriarch, and this was her place to celebrate. As her resolve hardened, Margaret noticed another regular, Mrs. Harper, a few tables away. Seeing Margaret's distress, Mrs. Harper began discreetly recording the interaction on her smartphone, sensing the tension might escalate. "I don't understand. There must be some mistake," Margaret insisted, her voice firm. "Please check the reservation list again." Peter rolled his eyes, brushing off her request. "As I said, there's no need to check. You need to leave." Margaret stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. "I will not be spoken to in this manner, young man. I am here to celebrate, and I shall not be turned away." The standoff at the host station had begun to draw attention from other diners, their whispers filling the air with a mixture of curiosity and concern. As the murmurs grew louder, the moment seemed to teeter on the edge of a deeper conflict, one that could unravel into a night neither Margaret nor the Golden Mile could afford. Margaret stood firm, her gaze never wavering, as she looked into the eyes of the young waiter, who had dismissed her so coldly. She couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation that had crept over her. This was supposed to be a day of joy, a celebration of her life and memories. And here she was, made to feel small in a place she thought of as welcoming, a place she'd visited countless times. Peter's irritation only seemed to grow as the moments passed. The whispers from surrounding tables had clearly not gone unnoticed by him, and it seemed to feed his impatience. With a roll of his eyes, he crossed his arms and leaned in slightly. "Ma'am, I've already told you, there are no tables. You don't have a reservation, and I don't have time for this," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. Margaret took a deep breath, her shoulders set with quiet dignity. She was no stranger to encounters like these. She'd faced prejudice and indignity more times than she could count, and this was far from the first time someone had treated her with condescension. But there was something about Peter's tone and the way he dismissed her so easily that struck a chord deep within her. At that moment, Mrs. Harper, who had been observing the scene unfold, rose from her table. A frequent patron of the Golden Mile, Mrs. Harper knew Margaret by name and was visibly upset by the way her friend was being treated. She pulled out her smartphone and started recording, capturing Peter's dismissive tone and Margaret's calm yet resolute stance. "Excuse me," Mrs. Harper called out loudly enough to catch Peter's attention. "Are you really denying her service? This woman has been a regular here longer than you've likely been employed. You owe her more respect than this." Peter's face flushed as he turned to see Mrs. Harper filming. Embarrassed and clearly flustered, he straightened up, but his stubbornness remained. "This is between her and me, ma'am," he responded, trying to maintain control of the situation. "Oh, I think it's a little more than that," Mrs. Harper countered, her voice steely. You're showing blatant disrespect to a woman who's done nothing but expect the basic courtesy she's always received here. And you know what? The world's going to see it. Around them, diners pulled out their phones, some recording and others silently looking on, observing the tension in the air. Margaret noticed the steady, supportive gaze of strangers around her, and it gave her a renewed sense of courage. The world had changed in some ways since her youth. People were more willing to stand up, to make sure others saw the wrong that was being done. "Look, all of you need to put your phones away," Peter snapped, clearly rattled. "This isn't some kind of show." Margaret's voice cut through the air, calm but firm. "I didn't come here to cause trouble. I came to celebrate my birthday, with the reservation I made in advance. And yet, I am being dismissed as though I am invisible. Tell me, young man, what exactly do you have against me?" Peter faltered, but his face hardened. "Ma'am, I told you, we're busy tonight. And honestly, we don't have to serve everyone who walks in here expecting something." Margaret's jaw tightened, but her gaze remained steady. "I understand. I truly do. You see, I've been in places where I wasn't wanted more times than I care to remember, but I never thought this restaurant would be one of them." As Margaret's words hung in the air, Mrs. Harper took a step closer, her phone still recording. "What's happening here is bigger than a reservation. This is about the way people are treated, the way you're treating her, and the world deserves to see this." Peter's composure finally cracked, his face flushing as the weight of the situation dawned on him. He was losing control, and his frustration bled through as he muttered under his breath, "This is ridiculous." At that moment, Margaret felt a surge of strength rise within her. She hadn't expected this confrontation on her birthday, but she knew now that she wouldn't leave quietly. She wasn't just standing up for herself, but for the respect and dignity she'd fought for all her life. "Perhaps I need to speak to someone in charge," Margaret said clearly. "I'd like to talk to the manager." The demand rippled through the dining room, her voice carrying authority and calm resolve. The gathered patrons watched in anticipation as Peter, now visibly uncomfortable, turned to call for a superior. Margaret stood her ground, surrounded by the quiet solidarity of those witnessing her struggle, as she prepared for whatever came next. Margaret stood by the host station, her heart pounding as she awaited the arrival of the manager. She had always carried herself with quiet dignity, a trait she'd honed over decades of perseverance. Yet, this moment had left her feeling strangely vulnerable. Despite her determination, a familiar heaviness settled on her shoulders, a reminder of all she'd endured to stand her ground in a world that often dismissed her very presence. As she looked around the restaurant, her mind drifted to the past, a time when standing up for herself had carried far greater risks. Memories unfolded in her mind, vivid and unbidden, taking her back to her youth in the 1960s, when she had been a young woman, barely out of her teens, facing down the harsh realities of segregation. Margaret had grown up in the heart of Mississippi, where division wasn't just an unspoken rule, but a way of life. She remembered sitting in the back of buses, the colored signs over drinking fountains, and the sheer weight of injustice that hung heavy over her community. Her parents, though cautious, had taught her to value her identity and to hold her head high. "Don't let anyone make you feel small, Margaret," her mother used to say. "We are all equal under God's eyes." It was during that tumultuous time that Margaret had joined her local civil rights group, determined to be part of the change she believed in. She remembered the marches she had joined, the songs they'd sung in defiance, and the fear they'd swallowed when faced with violence and hostility. Those days had left scars, but they had also taught her resilience and the strength of her voice. Her most painful memory returned unbidden. One summer evening in 1965, when she and a group of friends had gathered in a local diner. The owner, a heavy-set man with a look of disdain, had ordered them out the moment they'd sat down. She recalled the fire in her chest as she'd stood up, unwilling to be turned away, only for him to call for the police. They had been taken to jail that night, spending hours in a cramped cell, their only crime being the desire to sit at a counter and order a cup of coffee. That memory lingered, as vivid as if it had happened only yesterday, and Margaret felt the familiar burn of injustice creeping up her spine. It was a reminder of how far she had come, yet how much work was still left to be done. The progress she had fought so hard for seemed distant now. As she stood here in Golden Mile, facing the same sense of rejection, she thought she had left behind. Suddenly her thoughts shifted to Jonathan, her son. Margaret had raised him to be a man of principle, and she was fiercely proud of the way he had carried those values into his adult life. After leaving Mississippi, she had settled in Chicago and devoted herself to giving Jonathan a life where he could feel proud of who he was. She had taught him to stand up for himself, to respect others, and to lead with kindness. When he'd gone on to open Golden Mile, it had felt like a victory, a place where everyone, regardless of their background, could feel welcome. Yet, here she was, his own mother, turned away by a young waiter who seemed to care little for the values she and Jonathan held dear. As she stood there, the irony of the situation hit her hard. She had spent her life fighting against discrimination, and now, on her 75th birthday, she was confronted with the very injustice she had battled for so long. It was a bitter pill to swallow, and it only fueled her resolve. Her thoughts were interrupted by the low hum of conversations around her. The other diners were still watching, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and intrigue. Margaret noticed Mrs. Harper give her a reassuring nod, her phone still capturing every moment. The silent support from those around her was a reminder of how times had changed in some ways. She was no longer alone in this fight. People were willing to step forward, to bear witness, and to hold those in power accountable. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Today wasn't just her birthday. It was a day to reaffirm her values, to stand tall for everything she had believed in all her life. She wasn't just fighting for her right to be here at Golden Mile. She was fighting for all those who had been told they didn't belong, for every young person who might face the same dismissal and scorn. Peter returned to the counter, his face flushed with frustration. The escalating tension in the room had clearly rattled him, but instead of easing up, he seemed to double down. Perhaps the attention only made him more determined to assert his control over the situation, or perhaps he resented the scrutiny. Whatever the reason, his tone grew even sharper. "Look, I don't know what you're trying to prove here," Peter said, his voice carrying a bitter edge, "but I've told you there's no space. You need to leave, or I'll have to call security." Margaret's eyes narrowed, the quiet strength in her gaze unmoved. "Call whoever you need to. I have a reservation, and I intend to stay." Several tables over, Mrs. Harper raised her voice, her phone still recording. "She has every right to be here. This kind of treatment is unacceptable." Her words rang out, drawing the attention of more onlookers. Peter's frustration grew visibly, and he looked around, realizing that more and more patrons were now watching him with expressions of disapproval. He turned back to Margaret, his tone shifting from dismissive to outright hostile. "You people think you can come in here and cause a scene? This isn't the place for that. There are other restaurants more suited for—" He trailed off, but the implication hung in the air, stinging like an open wound. Margaret felt the full weight of his words, each syllable laced with a prejudice she knew all too well. Decades of resilience bubbled up within her, and she steadied her breath, unwilling to let herself be intimidated. Her gaze met his with quiet defiance, a silent reminder that she had endured far worse and would not be silenced now. Mrs. Harper, however, was not as quiet. She took a step forward, her voice unwavering. "Did everyone hear that? This man is openly discriminating against a guest who has done nothing but expect basic courtesy. And this is how Golden Mile treats its loyal customers?" The energy in the room shifted. Several patrons began murmuring in agreement, and more phones appeared, cameras rolling. In today's digital age, everyone knew that moments like these did not stay confined within four walls. Every word, every gesture could go viral in an instant, and the pressure of the moment was clearly building around Peter. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Peter seemed to panic, though he tried to mask it with a cold exterior. "Everyone needs to put their phones away and stop recording," he snapped, the edge of desperation slipping into his voice. "This is private property, and you can't just film whatever you want." But the crowd was unmoved, their expressions resolute as they continued recording. Margaret knew that the tables had turned in a way Peter hadn't anticipated. No longer was this simply a matter between her and him. It had become a spectacle, a confrontation of principles, and the people around her had made it clear where they stood. Suddenly, there was a loud chime from Margaret's phone. She glanced down at it, momentarily breaking her focus on Peter. Her heart leapt when she saw it was a message from Jonathan, her son, asking if everything was okay. He had seen Mrs. Harper's video, which was already circulating online with comments expressing shock, outrage, and support. Margaret felt a surge of relief. She replied quickly, briefly explaining what had happened. Within moments, she received another message. "Stay put, Mom. I'm on my way." Knowing Jonathan was coming filled Margaret with a renewed sense of confidence. She would not be standing alone for long. Her son, whom she had raised to value justice and equality, was on his way to stand by her side, and that knowledge gave her strength. Peter, meanwhile, seemed to recognize that he was losing control. His frustration morphed into something darker, and he took a final step toward Margaret, his voice barely contained. "This isn't a place for people like you. You don't belong here, and you never will." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone. Margaret felt a flash of anger, but kept her composure, her voice steady as she responded. "People like me? I've spent my entire life hearing that. But let me tell you something, young man. I belong wherever I choose to be, and I will not leave because of your narrow-minded prejudice." A ripple of applause broke out, small at first, but growing as more patrons joined in. Their expressions a mixture of admiration and solidarity. The energy in the room had shifted entirely. No longer just witnesses, the patrons became Margaret's allies, their support a tangible force against Peter's hostility. Just then, the door swung open and Jonathan entered, his gaze sweeping the room until it landed on his mother. His face was set, his expression one of both anger and disappointment. He strode toward the host station, each step measured, his eyes fixed on Peter. Peter paled as he realized who Jonathan was. The crowd fell silent, and all eyes turned to the confrontation that was about to unfold. Jonathan reached his mother, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder, then turned to face Peter, his voice cold and unwavering. "Care to explain what's going on here?" Jonathan asked, his gaze never leaving Peter. The young waiter stammered, his earlier arrogance replaced with fear and confusion. He glanced at the crowd, then back at Jonathan, but he seemed at a loss for words. The atmosphere in the room was electric, filled with anticipation. Margaret felt a surge of pride as she looked at her son, knowing he was here to defend the values they both held dear. This moment was no longer just a confrontation. It was a stand for everything they believed in. Jonathan's gaze remained fixed on Peter, his expression a mixture of anger and determination. The energy in the room was taut, as though everyone were holding their breath, waiting to see how the situation would unfold. Margaret stood by her son, feeling a deep sense of pride mixed with a simmering anger. This was a moment she had never anticipated, facing discrimination in a place built by her own son, a place where she had always felt at home. Peter, visibly nervous, shifted uncomfortably under Jonathan's piercing stare. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out, and his eyes darted around the room as though looking for a way to escape the intensity of the confrontation. Jonathan broke the silence, his voice low but firm. "I'd like to hear your explanation, Peter. Why is my mother standing here, humiliated and denied service, while you've been treating her with blatant disrespect?" A murmur rippled through the crowd as the patrons realized the full gravity of the situation. Margaret wasn't just a loyal customer. She was the mother of the restaurant's owner. The weight of Jonathan's words seemed to hit Peter like a physical blow, and he swallowed hard, his face pale. I didn't know she was your mother, sir," Peter stammered, attempting to regain his composure. "If I had known, Jonathan cut him off, his voice steady. "That's not the point, Peter. You shouldn't treat anyone like this, regardless of who they are. Every person who walks into this restaurant deserves respect. And yet, you've made my mother feel unwelcome in her own son's establishment." Peter's face twisted with a mixture of regret and defiance. "I just thought, we have standards here, and He trailed off, realizing too late that his excuses were only digging him deeper. Jonathan's jaw tightened, his eyes hardening. "Standards? Are you saying that my mother, a woman who has supported this place since day one, somehow doesn't meet your standards?" His voice was sharper now, and the room grew even quieter. Peter floundered, the defiance in his expression fading as he realized the severity of his actions. He glanced around at the onlookers, each face watching him with varying degrees of disappointment and disapproval. There was no way out of this, and he seemed to understand that now. Margaret placed a gentle hand on Jonathan's arm, a signal that she had something to say. Jonathan nodded, giving her the floor. She looked directly at Peter, her voice calm but unyielding. "I've faced people like you my whole life. People who look at me and think they know everything they need to know, just from my appearance. But I have never let that stop me, and I won't let it stop me now." The words were simple, but the impact was profound. A few patrons clapped softly, their faces reflecting admiration and respect for Margaret's resilience. Peter, on the other hand, looked down, unable to meet her gaze. Jonathan turned back to Peter, his expression resolute. "Peter, this isn't just a mistake. It's a clear violation of the values we hold in this establishment. You have not only failed to uphold the respect and dignity we expect from our staff, but you have also publicly embarrassed my mother and diminished the trust our patrons place in us." Peter looked as though he wanted to protest, but the weight of Jonathan's words silenced him. He had overstepped, and there was no justification he could give that would undo the damage. "You're dismissed from your position," Jonathan continued, his voice calm yet firm. "You're no longer welcome to work here." Peter's face twisted with shock, but he seemed to understand that there was no room for negotiation. He turned abruptly, gathering his things, and made a hasty exit as the room watched in silence. As he left, Jonathan's gaze remained steady, his focus returning to his mother as he reached out, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. Margaret looked up at him, her eyes shining with pride and relief. She knew that Jonathan's decision hadn't been easy, but it was necessary. The values she had instilled in him, the lessons she had passed down, had come full circle in this moment. Turning to the assembled patrons, Jonathan spoke, his voice carrying a note of conviction. "I want to apologize to all of you who witnessed this incident. My mother should never have been subjected to such treatment, and no one should. This restaurant was founded on the principle that everyone is welcome here. Discrimination has no place in Golden Mile, and we will work tirelessly to ensure that this mistake is never repeated." The crowd erupted in applause, their approval ringing through the restaurant as people showed their support for Margaret and Jonathan. The sense of unity and shared values was palpable, a powerful reminder of the strength that came from standing up for what was right. As the applause subsided, Jonathan addressed the staff, many of whom were watching with solemn expressions. "Starting tomorrow, we will implement training sessions focused on respect, inclusion, and diversity. We'll work to ensure that Golden Mile is a place where everyone is valued and treated with dignity." He turned back to his mother, his voice softening as he spoke directly to her. "I'm so sorry, Mom. This should never have happened, especially not here. I promise, we'll do better." Margaret placed a reassuring hand on his, her voice filled with warmth. "I know, Jonathan, you've done the right thing, and I couldn't be prouder of the man you've become." As the evening continued, the atmosphere in the restaurant gradually returned to normal, but the memory of the incident lingered. People exchanged words of support with Margaret and Jonathan, reaffirming their faith in Golden Mile. That night, the restaurant became more than just a dining establishment. It became a symbol of resilience, a place that would stand as a testament to the power of unity and the unwavering belief in equality. The days following the incident at Golden Mile were a whirlwind for Jonathan. News of the confrontation had quickly spread online, with countless people viewing and sharing the video taken by Mrs. Harper. Comments flooded social media, expressions of support, messages of outrage, and discussions about the persistent problem of discrimination in everyday spaces. Though the initial shock of the situation was overwhelming, Jonathan knew that this was a pivotal moment for both himself and the restaurant he had built on the principles of inclusivity and respect. Jonathan understood that dismissing Peter had been only the first step. The real work lay ahead. He needed to restore trust, not just with his patrons, but also with his staff. Golden Mile's reputation, once associated with warmth and welcome, had been called into question, and he felt a deep responsibility to address the issue head-on. The first thing he did was schedule a staff meeting, calling everyone together to address the incident and discuss how they would move forward as a team. Margaret attended, sitting quietly in the back as Jonathan spoke, her presence a grounding reminder of the purpose behind his actions. Jonathan began the meeting by acknowledging the hurt and disappointment caused by the incident. "I want to start by saying that what happened was unacceptable," he said, his voice steady. "We failed not only a loyal customer, but also the values that we're supposed to stand for. From this moment forward, things are going to change, and we're going to do better." The room was silent as the staff listened intently. Many of them hadn't realized the depth of Jonathan's commitment to inclusivity until now. He continued, outlining a new training initiative that would become a permanent part of Golden Mile's operations. The sessions would focus on diversity, cultural sensitivity, and customer respect, ensuring that every employee understood the importance of treating each patron with dignity, regardless of their background. Margaret watched her son with quiet pride. She knew the pain of prejudice too well, but seeing Jonathan address his team with such conviction brought a sense of hope that her experiences and the hard lessons of the past would finally serve to create a lasting change. "We are also going to partner with local organizations that focus on equality and inclusion," Jonathan added. "Golden Mile will be more than a restaurant. It will be a place where people of all backgrounds are welcome and celebrated. This will be part of our community outreach, and I want each of you to feel empowered to contribute to that mission." Several staff members nodded, and a few even voiced their support. Jonathan's sincerity and commitment to turning this moment into a movement seemed to resonate with them. He could feel the atmosphere shift, a renewed sense of purpose taking root among the team. After the meeting, Jonathan sat down with his mother in a quiet corner of the restaurant. They sipped coffee in silence for a moment, the weight of recent events heavy between them. He turned to her, his expression somber. "Mom, I don't know if I can ever truly make up for what happened," he said quietly. "I thought I was doing enough to create an inclusive space, but now I see that it wasn't enough." Margaret reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "What matters is that you're willing to learn and grow from this," she replied. "It's easy to say you believe in something, but living those values takes courage and commitment. You're doing exactly that, Jonathan, and I couldn't be prouder." Her words were a balm, soothing the lingering doubt in his mind. Jonathan nodded, absorbing her wisdom, feeling more resolved than ever. "Thank you, Mom. I promise. I'll keep doing everything I can to make Golden Mile a place you can be proud of." In the following weeks, the changes Jonathan implemented began to take shape. The training session started, with employees engaging in discussions about respect, empathy, and understanding. Guest speakers from local advocacy groups shared their insights, giving the staff a broader perspective on the impact of their actions. Slowly, Jonathan saw his team transform, each member developing a renewed sense of commitment to the values that Golden Mile stood for. Golden Mile's outreach extended beyond its walls. The restaurant began hosting monthly events that celebrated diverse cultures and communities, inviting people from all backgrounds to share their stories, art, and music. The events attracted a wide range of patrons, and soon, Golden Mile became a symbol of unity in the neighborhood. Social media also played a role in this transformation. The same platforms that had shared the initial incident now highlighted Golden Mile's journey toward inclusivity. Posts showcasing the restaurant's events, community partnerships, and training sessions began to circulate, reshaping its image and helping people see that Jonathan was committed to real, lasting change. One evening, as the restaurant bustled with life and laughter, Margaret sat by the window, observing the lively scene with a heart full of pride. She saw patrons from all walks of life enjoying their meals, engaging in conversations, and sharing in a sense of belonging that transcended backgrounds. This was the dream she had fought for, the vision she had hoped her son would one day bring to life. Jonathan approached her, his face softened with a quiet smile as he took the seat beside her. "Look around, Mom," he said, gesturing to the diverse crowd filling the tables. "This is what we've worked for. This is what Golden Mile stands for." Margaret's eyes glistened with tears of joy. "Yes, Jonathan," she replied, her voice filled with emotion. "This is everything I dreamed of and more. You've done something truly remarkable here." The two sat in contented silence, watching as the restaurant thrived, a testament to resilience, community, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her son. They both knew there was still work to be done, but in this moment, surrounded by the warmth of the Golden Mile community, they felt a profound sense of accomplishment. Golden Mile had become more than just a place to eat. It was a beacon of hope and unity, a place where all were welcome, just as Jonathan and Margaret had always envisioned. Several months had passed since the incident that had forever changed the atmosphere at Golden Mile. The restaurant now thrived as a place of unity, a hub where the values of acceptance, respect, and community were as central as the food itself. Jonathan and Margaret had both been humbled by the journey, but they were also deeply gratified by the transformation they had witnessed. Tonight was a special evening at Golden Mile, an event that Margaret had been planning for weeks. The restaurant had been decorated with soft lights, and tables were arranged to encourage a sense of togetherness. Patrons from the local community and beyond had gathered, filling the room with a warmth that spoke of shared purpose and celebration. As the evening settled in, Jonathan took the stage at the center of the restaurant, his gaze sweeping across the familiar faces in the crowd. He saw neighbors, friends, local leaders, and new patrons who had come to witness Golden Mile's story, a story that had transcended an ordinary dining experience. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Jonathan began, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "This place started as a dream to create a community that could come together, share stories, and celebrate one another. And though that dream was challenged, it's only grown stronger. We've learned that our actions matter, and every interaction shapes the legacy we leave behind." The crowd clapped warmly, voices murmuring their appreciation. Many had followed Golden Mile's journey closely, watching the restaurant's commitment to becoming a symbol of inclusivity, and they were eager to show their support. Jonathan continued, "My mother has been my inspiration in all of this. She has taught me the values that I carry every day and has shown me what it means to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." He paused, a look of profound respect in his eyes as he glanced toward Margaret, seated near the front. "So tonight, we honor her and everyone who has fought for the dignity and respect that each person deserves." The applause grew, filling the room with warmth. Margaret felt a swell of emotion as she looked at her son, her heart full of pride and gratitude. The struggle she had faced on her birthday months ago had not been in vain. It had sparked a change not only in Golden Mile, but in the hearts of all who witnessed the transformation. When the applause subsided, Jonathan stepped aside, gesturing for his mother to join him on stage. She stood up, her movement slow and deliberate as she made her way to the front. Though she had lived a life marked by quiet resilience, tonight she felt an overwhelming sense of joy and fulfillment. This moment was hers, and it belonged to all those who had walked alongside her in spirit. Taking the microphone, Margaret looked out over the sea of faces. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I stand here tonight as a testament to the power of resilience and community. My life has not always been easy, and I know many of you have faced struggles of your own. But I believe that when we come together, when we listen and truly see one another, we create something powerful." She paused, glancing at Jonathan and then back to the crowd. "Tonight is not just about celebrating what we have overcome. It's about honoring the road ahead. We have made great strides, but our journey toward understanding and respect continues. And I hope that each of you will carry this message forward in your own lives." Her words hung in the air, a profound reminder that the fight for equality was ongoing, a journey that required each person's commitment. As she stepped down, the crowd stood, giving her a standing ovation that filled the restaurant with thunderous applause. It was a moment of unity, a recognition of the strength and spirit that had brought them together. After the event, Margaret and Jonathan sat together in a quiet corner, watching as patrons lingered, sharing conversations and laughter. The restaurant was alive with warmth, and the sense of unity they had worked so hard to cultivate was now tangible. Jonathan looked at his mother, his expression soft. "Mom, I don't think I could have done any of this without you. This place, it's as much yours as it is mine." Margaret smiled, reaching out to take his hand. "No, Jonathan. You took what I taught you and made it into something more beautiful than I could have ever imagined. This is your legacy now." They sat in companionable silence, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The struggles, the lessons, the triumphs, all had led them here, to a place where the values they cherished were alive and thriving. As the evening wound down, Margaret and Jonathan watched their patrons leave, each one offering words of gratitude and support. The night had been a reminder that Golden Mile was not just a restaurant. It was a place where people felt seen, where stories were shared, and where everyone, regardless of their background, knew they belonged. And as the last patron left, Margaret looked around the room, her heart filled with hope for the future. Golden Mile had become a beacon of unity, a symbol of resilience, and a reminder that change was always possible. Thank you for joining me for this story. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel to stay updated on the heartfelt stories I'm passionate about sharing. Your support means the world to me and motivates me to keep creating. I'm truly grateful to have you on this journey with me.